these are not normal times we are in. And this is a very busy day for me. I just got off another shiur, and right after our shiur, there will be another. And I said just a short while ago that every year, as Rosh Hashanah approaches, we say, Tichle Shona v'kiraloiseha, Tochel Shona v'berchoiseha. And usually it's just somewhat of a greeting. I think these words this year carry that much more meaning. Tichle Shona v'kiraloiseha, Tochel Shona v'berchoiseha. Yes, COVID-19 has been a curse. And we daven and we hope that HaKadosh Baruch Hu will take it away. So many passages and many things in our tefillas, many psukim, will have a different meaning this year. When we say, Mi barash u mi b'magefa. So usually, well, it's in a sanatoikev. Hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, people died from magefas. These words mean so much this year. Mi barash, mi b'magefa. Tichle shona v'kiraloiseyo, tochel shona v'berchoiseyo. So every year before Ben Kesel, also between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we really have a very, very important kenes. Hundreds of Rabbonim come together. And I sit with a panel of doctors. And we take questions from the Rabbonim. And I try to give halachic guidance to Rabbonim. This year it won't happen because we can't bring people together. So in a way, I thank Agudas Yisrael of America for giving us all this opportunity to try to be helpful to Rabbonim, to doctors, and to lay people, to everyone. So when we deal with questions of Cholim b'Yom Kippurim, it's a huge challenge and even a greater responsibility. We're dealing with the two mitzvahs hachamuros b'Torah, the two greatest mitzvahs. On one hand, Tanas b'Yom Kippurim is kores, chai v'krisis. On the other hand, pikuach nefesh doiche kol haTorah kulo. To find the right balance and to give the right halacha, one needs tremendous siyata d'shmaya. And I am constantly humbled by this responsibility. And I daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu shomein kosher b'dvar halacha. So when pikuach nefesh, or safek pikuach nefesh, or svek shel pikuach nefesh, contradicts fasting and Yom Kippur, pikuach nefesh overrides Yom Kippur. Just like pikuach nefesh overrides Shabbos. V'chai behem v'lo sheyamus behem. There's an amazing letter that Reb Shila Belzer wrote his Machuten, the Vishnitzer Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzaddik. So many years ago, the Tzemach Tzaddik was told by his doctors that he cannot fast on Yom Kippur. And he was in terrible distress. His family turned to his great Machuten, the Belzerov, should write him a letter of chizuk and give him some encouragement. And Reb Shila Mibelz, the Belzerov, writes that he was present and he remembers when the Sar Sholem of Belz, the very first Belzerov, was in the same situation, and he could not fast on Yom Kippur. When he ate in Yom Kippur, he ate b'simcha gedola that was only seen when he ate kazayis, matzah, b'leil haseder. And he said, l'shem yichud, he's coming to be Mekayim, the biggest mitzvah in the Torah, which is pikuach nefesh. It's an amazing story which does demand an explanation because it is clear in the poskim that if you need to eat in Yom Kippur, you need to do so with profound sadness. After all, it's a mitzvah to fast on Yom Kippur. I don't think it's a stira. Simcha on one hand, the simcha to be Mekayim, exactly what HaKadosh Baruch Hu demands and expects and commands. This is the mitzvah of a choyle sheyesh b'sakana. And at the same time, saddened by the fact that in this situation we cannot fast and be Mekayim the mitzvah of ve'nisem es nafshu seich. So this is a challenge and a great responsibility. As is very well known, Reb Chaim Brisker was extremely makel in fasting by any chashash of sakana. And the way Reb Chaim phrased it, Reb Chaim said, I'm not a makel in Hilchos Shabbos. I'm not a makel in Dinei Hatzoim. I am a machmir in Hilchos Pekuach Nefesh. So the reason I have this yearly kenes of Rabbonim is to pasken in dinam of choyle b'yom kippurim like any other halachas that have to do with medical situations. One needs to understand the basics of medicine and have somewhat of an understanding of medical dilemmas. Halacha is eternal. Halacha doesn't change. We learn the very same halachas that we learned in the Mishnah and in the Gemara thousands of years ago. The very same halachas that we find in Shulchan Aruch and the Ramo and in the Rambam hundreds of years ago. Halacha is eternal. But in many areas, halacha depends on the development and involvement of different areas. And halacha depends on the way medicine develops and what we know about certain conditions and ailments and illnesses that were not known in the past. So the development of medical knowledge and scientific knowledge does have an effect on the way we pasken halachas. So I remember a few years ago when I sat with my doctors preparing the kenes for Yom Kippur, and every year we usually choose a certain central topic to discuss. And we were discussing various different illnesses. Do they need to eat? And one of the doctors honestly said, how would I know? I studied medicine 10 years, 12 years. I don't remember one course or even one lecture that was dedicated to the questions, so which choyle needs to eat? In days of yore, in the times of the Mishnah and the Gemara, in the Rambam and the Ramban, medicine was mostly about eating and drinking. There are so many sugyas in Shas in which Chazal deal with various different sicknesses and ailments, and Chazal say, so squash is good for that, cucumbers are good for that, and fish is not good for your eyes. And Chazal deal with the question, what is better, beef or chicken? They really had no medicine. They had some herbal medicine, but it was mostly about eating and drinking, food and drinks. There was no surgery, and there was so little medical knowledge. No wonder the Tosis and Moed Katan Daf Yud Gimel says that all the trufos and refuas that we find in Shas are no longer Nagea Bismanenu. That's a Tosis and Moed Katan Daf Yud Gimel. So this doctor honestly said, well, in medicine we assume if a person needs to eat, then he will eat. If he's hungry, then obviously he needs to eat. But it's not part of our training to say, when does a choyle need to eat? But al pi halacha, yes, we consult doctors, because after all, doctors know far more than the average person about the human body, the way it works, the way it ticks. So We could definitely determine certain situations when a person needs to drink to prevent the dehydration, which is a grave danger. I just want to explain that halachic ruling is so dependent on what we know about medicine. There are piskei halacha that we find in the most important halachic sources, which are clearly based on lack of knowledge and ignorance. And I don't say ignorance in a negative way, in the most positive way. So that Amon Simen Tov Reish Yud Ches Sivav says that if a person is ill and he seems to be seriously ill and there's no doctor around, we ask the people. And if most of the people think he's a choile sheyesh b'sekona, then we give him food and drinks. We turn to the people, because if there's no doctor present, then im nere leroiv b'nei adam, so it's totally coincidental who are the people that happen to be present. We ask them, what do you think? And if they think he needs to eat, then we go bosaroiv and we give him food. Today, well, probably this person would Erev Yom Tov consult his doctors. We would make a phone call or try to know and understand what a situation is or get him to the hospital. But in days of yore, if we couldn't consult a doctor, we just asked the people, what do you think? And what they said has halachic relevance. Aruch HaShulchan, Tov Reish Yud Ches Sif Aleph says that if a person is ill, he's not feeling well, and we have no idea whether he's a choile sheyesh b'sekona, choile she'ein b'sekona, then if he can't get out of bed, probably he's a choile sheyesh b'sekona, and he could eat and drink. I don't think that would be criteria in our day and age if he can't get out of bed. There are so many reasons that a person can't get out of bed, and the fact that he could get out of bed doesn't mean that he's well. So medicine has developed and evolved, and we know that much more today than we did in the past. And that is why paskening in our modern day and age, halachas of Cholim b'Yom Kippurim, demands more understanding and knowledge and insight about medicine than was required from poskim many years ago. Another example I wanted to give is, how do we relate to epidemics? Because we are in the midst of a terrible pandemic. So just for those that probably don't have the right terminology, a pandemic is a global epidemic. COVID-19 is a pandemic affecting every town, every city, every corner of the globe, besides Antarctica. But an epidemic is when a megefa strikes a town, a city, a country. How do we relate to epidemics? Chazal, with their ultimate knowledge, Chazal is Ruach HaKodesh, Soid Hashem liyareyav. So the Gemara in Bava Kama Daf Samach says, Deva be'ir kaneis raglecha. If there's an epidemic in the city, lock yourself into a home. And the Gemara quotes the Pasuk, which I quoted 1,000 times, especially at the beginning of this epidemic months ago. Lech ami, boi b'chadorecha, uzgored losecho ba'adecha. So the Gemara clearly says, when there's a magefa, b'shas dever be'ir kaneis reglecha, go into your inner chambers and lock the door. 500 years ago, many poskim, including the Ramah, the Shlit, some of the Rishonim before them, understood that an epidemic comes from ipush hu'avia, the air, is foul. The air is not good. And that is why the paskin, you need to run away. Leave your town, leave your city, go elsewhere. People were dying. And the medical understanding at the time was, it's in the air. And that is why, if there's an epidemic in this city, in this town, run away. Pack up and run away. The Shlo Kodesh writes, at the time of the Black Death, the Black Plague, and some epidemics that came after the terrible plague, that if a person doesn't leave the town, he is mischayev benafshay. He's putting his children in danger. V'osed litnes adin. And they weren't aware that by running away and going elsewhere, you're spreading the illness. And you're taking the illness from your town and from your city to distant places. It's not ipushu avir. It's not the air. It's people infecting one the other. And that is why Chazal say, keep away from people. 200, 300 years transpired. And Rabbi Kiva Eger and some other Gedolim of his time, going back 188 years, Tov Kuf Tzadik Beis, in one of the cholera outbreaks. And cholera struck Jewish communities in Europe in waves. Tov Kuf Tzadik Beis, Tov Reish Tes, Tov Reish Lamed Gimel. It came and went. And Rabbi Kiva Eger writes clearly, before Rosh Hashanah, and I know many Rabbanim throughout the world are dealing and grappling with the question, how will we daven on Rosh Hashanah? And we are grappling with the same question in Eretz Yisrael. So the most important source is Rabbi Kiva Eger, going back almost 200 years. Rabbi Kiva Eger wrote Takonos, originally in German, Loshen Ashkenaz. That was the language they all understood. Tovshin Lamed Aleph, 50 years ago, Hagon Hagol Reb Nosson Gestetner from Bnei Brak translated this Kuntres into Loshen Kodesh. He was an Einikal of Rabbi Kiva Eger. And it's an amazing document. First and foremost, Rabbi Kiva Eger says, we know from our medical professionals that we must keep space between people. And it's a terrible danger if people come too close to each other. So we could only have 50% of the members in our shuls. So how do we determine who comes in and who stays out? Unbelievable. Rabbi Kiva Eger flipped a coin. He made a goyrel. And the goyrel determined that everybody that has an odd-numbered seat will have a seat in Rosh Hashanah. And between one seat and the other, there needs to be an empty seat. All the even numbers could come to Shul on Yom Kippur. That those that come on Rosh Hashanah cannot come on Yom Kippur. Those that can't come Rosh Hashanah, they will have entrance on Yom Kippur. And Rabbi Kiva Eger writes that the Mishtara v'Mishmar Tzva'i, we will have the army and the police keeping order. Yom Gimel Afnei Rosh Hashanah, we will be handing out tickets, and only a ticket holder will have entrance to the shul. All the others, we will organize minyanim in private homes and in private yards. And the Kehillah will see to it that you have a Bal Tefillin, a Bal Tekeh, and a Shofar, and a Sefer Torah. And Rabbi Kiva Eger, please space out your private minyanim as well and have empty seats. So in the days of Rabbi Kiva Eger, they knew that the way to contain infectious disease and epidemics is by social distancing. That was Tov Kuf Tzadik Beis, Tov Reish Lamed Gimel. 40 years later, we find another tshuva. Rabbi Yosef Zechariyahu Stern, one of the great Gedolim in Lita, Shalosh Tshuva Zecher Yosef Simen Reish Yud Gimel, deals with the question, do healthy people need to eat or drink on Yom Kippur in a time of a megeva, of an epidemic. He disagrees with Reb Salanter, and he says they have no problem fasting. What is more important is social distancing. Zeicha Yehoisef Siman Reishut Gimel, and he writes, we should skip the piyutim, shorten the tefillah in shul. People shouldn't be together in a closed place for too long. So obviously, 200 years ago, in the days of Rabbi Kiva and the Zeicha Yehoisef, they knew it's not in the air. The outside air is okay. It's in people coming too close to each other. So this is another example how the development and evolvement of medical knowledge affects the Psak Halacha. So if 500 years ago the Psak was, run away, if there's an epidemic, leave town. You're putting your children in danger because the air is foul, the air is terrible. You need to go elsewhere. 200 years ago they understood the wisdom of Chazal. Kanes raglecha. So I'm just giving you a very brief example of the challenges that a posek has as we need to deal with halachic issues in every generation, in every time. And medical insight and understanding and knowledge develops at such a rapid pace in our day and age, far faster than ever before. So we need a lot of siyata d'shmaya, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu should help us all. Shalom nekoshel b'dvar halacha. So this was just a very brief introduction about the challenges that a posek faces dealing with medical issues. And these are the most chumrah questions that we can ever have. On one hand, Oichel v'shoyse b'yom Kippurim is a chiyuv kores. On the other hand, pikuach nefesh doicha kol haTorah kula. One point which doesn't have much halachic relevance, but it's an amazing insight that we find in the Rambam, Perek Aleph Milchos Mila. Not in Hilchos Shabbos or in Hilchos Shvisas Osor, or in Hilchos Yesoida HaTorah and Perek. Those are the primary sources in which we learn dinam of pikuach nefesh. Cholim b'yom Kippurim, cholim b'Shabbos, all the dinam of Yehereg, Valyava, Perek Yesoida HaTorah, but rather in Perek Hamed the Mila, when the Rambam brings the din of Tinuk Shemeso Echov Machmas Mila, we don't do mitzvahs Mila if the mitzvah could put the child's life in danger, in jeopardy. The Rambam says, Pikuach nefesh doicha kol haTorah kula. But then the Rambam adds on his own. Any mitzvah that you violated, you still will have a chance to be Makayim in the future. Nefesh Adam she'ovad hi efshar lahachzira. But the life of a person that was lost, you will never be able to bring back. So the Rambam shares with us some profound feeling about pikuach nefesh, which is doicha kol haTorah kula. So my dear friend Rabbi Garazman, I just wanted to share with our Choshevet Tzibor what it means to be a posek dealing with medical issues in general and with Yom Kippur and pikuach nefesh questions in particular. So I think at this stage, maybe we should move forward and deal with more specific questions that have come from the Tzibur.
Okay, the Rav mentioned this, and the Olam has indicated a lot of interest. Could the Rav expand a bit about the story with Rabbi Yisrael Salanter and the psak that has come down through us, through story sources, and how it has implications for today?
Yes, so the story is definitely a true story, even though there are different versions exactly what happened. So most of the sources are really from Sipurei Tzadikim and Sforim written about the history and the life of Gedolim. It's not brought in many sources, but as we know, Reb Salanter, it was Tofresh Tes. Reb Salanter was a younger man in Vilna, and it was one of the waves of the cholera epidemic. And Reb Salanter got up Yom Kippur on the bima with a piece of cake, and he made a mezainis, and he ate. And he told the entire tzibur, everyone should go home right now. It was after Shachris, and eat, and come back for Tkiyas Shofar and Musaf. He was not addressing the ill, but the healthy, and was a very controversial psak. In my forum, and in many shurim I gave, I brought various different sources from Shalas Tshuvis. Mitzpah Arya was Rab Arya Leib Broida, who was the Rav of Lemberg after Reb Tzvi Hersh Orenstein. And he writes that he knows that the Shoylem Eshev, Tofresh Tes, paskind in Lemberg, that even the healthy should eat. And that substantiates the story about Rebbe Salanter. So some of the storytellers say that he made Kiddush. That's questionable, but he did paskin that even the healthy should eat. What would be the basis of that psak? Naturally, we're dealing Yom Kippur, not Rosh Hashanah. Yeah, I just made a mistake a few moments ago, and I apologize. Rosh Hashanah wouldn't be a Kiddush. And Yom Kippur, we don't have Tkiyas Shofar. Goes without saying. It was Yom Kippur, and Absor Paskin. Everybody needs to eat. Because it's a story, and we don't have a tshuva of Rebbe Salanter, we can only guess. And the Mitzpah Arya also doesn't expound and elaborate. So there are two ways to understand the psak of Rabbi Yisrael. Either the risk, as we know, dealing with COVID-19, you might be infected with a virus, but you still don't have the symptoms. Take some time for the symptoms to develop. So Rabbi Yisrael argued, you think you're healthy, you think you're fine, but maybe you're not. And if you did contract the virus, then you need to be makdim refuah lamaka, and you need to eat and drink to bolster your immune system and to be well. That would be one way to explain the psak. I think the psak was based on another assumption. If the healthy won't eat, and everybody wants to fast on Yom Kippur, and because we're dealing with the tzibur and not with individuals, there is room to be chayshish that the ill will want to fast as well. And some of them might die. So to care for the ill, the psak was even the healthy must eat. But that was the psak of Rabbi Salanter. His predecessor was Rabbi Yosef Shor Natanzan, a generation before him. And it is actually what we see in Chasam Sofer, Chelik Vav Semachav Gimel Chasam Sofer says we should consult the doctors. And whatever the doctors say is halacha. And if the doctors feel that everybody needs to eat, that is what they should do. But this psak was not agreed upon by all. In the very same time, Rabbi Salanter was a younger man in Vilna. The Av based in Vilna was Rabbi Tzalel HaKoyen. I think was about 40 years older than Rabbi Salanter, and he came out against the psak. Rabbi Shlomo and Rabbi Tzalel HaKoyen were the elders, and Chavrei based in Vilna Shalas Teshuvas Reishis Bikurim Siman Yud in a footnote. Rebbe Tzalal HaKohen doesn't bring Rebbe Sol Salante, but he writes, Tov Kuf Tzadik Beis, Tov Reish Tes, Tov Reish Lamed Gimel. I've been around in 3 different rounds and bouts with the cholera virus. Alofim v'Revov is fasted, and we know of no demise, which is a startling testimony, because in our day and age, many Rabbonim and many Lamdonim say, well, we cannot compare COVID-19, the coronavirus, to previous epidemics. Previous epidemics, everybody died. Death was everywhere. It's not true. Yes. 500 years ago, more than 500 years ago, the Black Death, the estimate is that between 30 and 50% of the European population died. But that wasn't the case in every epidemic. Rabbi Tzalal HaKohen is made. Alofim v'Revov is fasted, and we knew of no tragedy. And at that very same time, the Chassam Sofer, the Shoel HaMeshav, Reb Sol Salanta Paskin, even healthy people should eat and drink. So it wasn't because every other person died. But anyway, Rabbi Tzalal HaKohen disagreed. Rabbi Yosef Zechariah Stern disagreed, as I quoted before. Shuvas Zechi Yosef Simarei Shud Gimel Shuvas Reishis V'Kurim Siman Yud. What is more important, Rabbi Kiva Eger disagrees. And of the Kuntras Psokim V'Takonas Rabbi Kiva Eger writes, Yom Kippur is an Issa D'Oraisa. So we do not feel it would be right to paskin that everybody should eat on Yom Kippur. However, we will have 2 doctors in shul present at all time. And any person that doesn't feel well should consult our doctors. So on one hand, Rabbi Kiva Eger says there is no reason for healthy people not to fast. But on the other hand, we will have 2 doctors present in shul at all times, and Rabbi Kiva Eger pleads with the people. If you don't feel well, come and consult the doctors. Don't decide on your own. Don't try to be frum. So before Tisha B'Av, I wrote a tshuva. I don't think we could compare corona to cholera. And I think the psak with COVID-19 needs to be different, because cholera attacked the digestive system. And the primary reason for death was dehydration, terrible diarrhea. And people died in very short time from dehydration. And that is why it was so important having enough fluids in your body. COVID is different. So once again, just as I said before, our understanding of magefis and epidemics developed. And we also need to understand we cannot compare one magefa to another. So cholera was different than COVID-19 than corona. So I just gave a brief overview of the story of Rebbe Kiva Eger and its halachic implications.
Okay, so Lamaisa, the Rav at the end of what you just said, in fact, COVID is different. So we have a list of questions here, which are gaya to COVID, but let's, if we may, we should start with the primary question, which is people who are obviously in the hospital, clearly they're chalishesh b'sakana. But at what point someone, let's start with the kal to the chomer, someone who is high risk factor, what's the halacha on Yom Kippur? And should there be a psak that he should stay home so he doesn't bring himself into a possible sakana? Second, someone who is exhibiting symptoms, and every case is different, but let's say at the moment they're mild and they are treated better than used to, at what point in Yom Kippur do we start becoming, applying Tafresh Yud Ches? At what point does he move from a suffix into a possible chelik sheyesh b'sakana. In other words, what is the medical timeline, understanding that every case is different? How should Rabbanim and doctors approach this case? Third category are those people who may have already had it, and their bodies are weakened. Unfortunately, as the Rav knows, the long-term implications here are not yet well known, and therefore the siman that the Sefer Shulchan Aruch, that Sif Vav, where the Mechaber says, first of all, is this applicable in COVID, and how much is it applicable? We know now more than we knew 3 months ago. This is basically a long list of questions. Now that we know it's not exactly time to cholera, what is the proper approach to COVID? And then there's going to be a couple of follow-ups.
Okay, so let me try to share with you my opinion after very thorough consultation with doctors. I have some great doctor friends, and it is part of my responsibility all year round, being the Pesach for Shlit Tzedek Hospital and being consulted by many other medical institutions and doctors throughout the world. So yes, this is a virus we're still learning about, and there is still so much that we don't know and we don't understand, but we have come to know far more than we knew at the outbreak of this pandemic. And that is why treatment is more efficient today than it was at the beginning. And medical institutions throughout the world are doing far better than they did 6 months ago, or 5 or 4 months ago. So, based on the accumulative knowledge, I first want to make a comment which is not a pure halachic comment, but as Rabbi Goddison mentioned, the long-term effects of COVID-19 are significant. There is new research that even patients that had very mild symptoms or were asymptomatic, had no symptoms, might be severely impaired. It attacks the heart muscle, and it might have long-term effect on heart function. It affects the hippocampus, which is part of your brain that controls orientation and some other functions. It affects part of your brain that controls emotion, and that is why some people that have COVID, even though they tested negative, have bouts of anxiety. We still don't know enough about the long-term effects, but people will be carrying the scars of COVID-19, some of them for the rest of their lives. And the reason I'm saying this is some people are still mezalzel. It's the flu, it's not the flu. One of the shiurim I gave last week, I asked, do you know many people in which husband and wife died within a few days from the flu? Do you know so many families in which 2 brothers died from the flu within a week or within a month? Do you know many families in which father and son passed away in a short period from the flu? I don't know. And let me make this clear. I don't mean any party. I don't mean any group. I don't mean any Hasidus. I don't mean any specific family. There were many. I know at least 4 cases in which husband and wife passed away from COVID-19. Brothers and sisters and fathers and children. I know so many people that had COVID-19 3 or 4 or 5 months ago, and they're still suffering. They still have difficulty breathing. They still are suffering from terrible weakness, from disability to concentrate and function and do their job and learn. I say this because we still need to be extremely careful and cautious and follow the rules of the medical establishment. Regarding fasting, my psak is this. If you're young and healthy and you're not in a high risk bracket, you're not obese, you don't have any underlying medical issues, the vast majority will pass this disease with relatively very easy symptoms. They would not be defined as a choile sheyesh b'sikon. So if you're healthy, of course you need to fast. I made that clear before. If you're in bidud, in isolation, you need to fast because the vast majority of people in isolation, in quarantine, are healthy, are fine. You did contract the disease and you tested positive. If you have no symptoms, or even if you have mild symptoms, you're young, you're healthy, you're vibrant, no reason not to fast. You could fast. You feel well, you're asymptomatic, you have mild symptoms, but you are in a high risk bracket. You have hypertension, you're obese, you have other medical issues, then you should drink lishiyurim from the beginning of Yom Kippur. Drink a lot before Yom Kippur, drink lishiyurim. One of the implications of COVID-19 is compromising your kidney function. And that could be a sakana in the long run. So if you are in a high risk bracket, even if you're asymptomatic, you should drink. If you're ill, you're in the hospital, or even if you're home, because many people prefer not going to the hospital. I don't think it's very wise. But many people prefer, especially in Israel, there are hundreds of people that have oxygen, I don't know how it's called in English. The word escapes me. But they're taking oxygen at home.
Oxygenators.
If you are ill, difficulty breathing, high fever, then you should drink. I don't think you need to eat, but you need the fluids and consult your doctor. It's exactly a case in which the Shulchan Aruch, following the guidance of Chazal, say, consult your doctor. So I want to divide COVID patients into three different brackets. You're young, you're vibrant, you're healthy. You're not defined as a chodesh yesh b'sakon, and you could fast. Especially if you're carrying the disease for a few days and a considerable amount of time and you're doing well. Especially if you're doing better, you're feeling better. So the fact that you tested positive 3 months ago, you're still weak, you could fast, just like any other person that's weak. If you're in a high-risk bracket, don't fast, even if you feel well. Things could get worse very rapidly. And sometimes a COVID patient was feeling fine, and a day later, he was no longer with us. So you need to drink. Probably you could drink the shiurim, because if you're diligent with your shiurim, you're going to get enough fluids. If you're ill, if you're sick, consult your doctor. You definitely need to drink, and maybe you need to eat as well. So that is my general approach in Psak regarding COVID-19 and Yom Kippur.
Okay, so there are some follow-up questions here. I'm going to do one quickly. Is there a chiyuv to donate plasma A and B since we don't know what plasma works or not? Is there such a chiyuv?
One cannot say it's a chiyuv, but I do think it's a mitzvah. When a person donates a kidney, we do not know whether we will save that person's life. But we might. By every chodesh sheyesh b'sekona, when we're mechalel Shabbos, we do not know whether it might be futile or we will be saving a life. That is the nature of pikuach nefesh. There are some promising research and tests, so I definitely think it's a mitzvah to donate plasma. Would it be a chiyuv? I don't think it would be a chiyuv. I was also asked by researchers, could they do their research on. So a very prominent researcher scientist working in America, he's one of the groups, and he asked, do I work on Shabbos? And we're dealing with the Chil Shabbos Yoraisa, and my psak was, no, I don't think so. There are so many medical institutions working to find a vaccine or different medicines. Very difficult for me to see that Rabbi Yosef or Rabbi Moshe or Rabbi Yankel's working on Shabbos would ultimately make the difference. So you could put in extra hours during the week. I do not think that would be defined as pikuach nefesh to override Shabbos. So I do think it's a mitzvah to donate plasma, even though it's still too early to know how helpful that would be.
Here's a doctor asks the following question, which is a follow-up. I think the Rav answered the question, but I'll submit it again. He had a patient who was very seriously ill in his 60s, Baruch Hashem. He survived. He was on a ventilator 3 months ago, I assume between Purim and Pesach, or between Pesach and Shavuos, and now he is recovering. That's the medical background. Madinai.
So COVID-19 has its ups and downs, and there were so many cases of a person that was getting better, and they were planning his discharge from the hospital, and suddenly there was a sudden deterioration, and he passed away. So did he test negative, and now he's just recovering from the symptoms? In that case, he could fast. And that is what I mentioned before. He's weak, he's schwach. His halacha would be like any other person that was ill and he's recovering. So a person had surgery, even major surgery, 3 months ago, 4 months ago. He's recovering. He's still schwach, but he could fast by medical definition. But if he still is positive for COVID, even though he feels much better, but it could take a turn to the worse. So we still need to relate to him as a person that is seriously ill. And he should not fast. He should have fluids and maybe nourishment as well, as I explained before.
Okay, another question from a Rav. Social distancing in shuls is now obviously a major problem, both in Eretz Yisrael and America. It's a new issue for the Yom Ne'eram, and the Rav understands the complexities and implications of that. And this is negated to Rosh Hashanah too, should people who are healthy, but they have risk factors due to age, they're over 65, should they be told that they should not come to shul? Or maybe they should stand outside the shul and hear Tekiyah Shofar and go home? Because being in shul for 6 or 7 hours falls under the halacha of Shevi Estakein, and should be encouraged this way, given the fact that social distancing on Yom Ne'eram is going to be imperfect at best. It's the gisha to this.
But Shlomi, you're not aware that you're touching a very sensitive nerve.
I am well aware.
I was 65 2 years ago. So according to your question, I should be staying at home. But I do intend to go to shul and to be present from the entire tefillah, from Adain Olam to after Oleinu of Sef. But I do think that elderly people and people that have medical issues, my advice to them is, even if you have a responsible shul, in my shul, everyone wears masks. No one would dare to take off his mask in the middle of the davening, and we are spaced out. So we tape down many seats, and we have about 35% of what the shul could comfortably, seat. But I do tell elderly people, to me, 65 is not an old man, because I don't like to see myself as an old man. Kadosh Baruch Hu should give me many, many more years to serve Klal Yisrael together with all of you. But I do think elderly people, my advice to them is daven shachris at home. People that have medical issues, daven shachris at home. I know you want to come to shul for davening. Musaf is more important because of Tkiyah Shofar, and Malchi is Zechroinoi Shofros. If you daven b'yachidus, you're losing that. So my advice to elderly people, especially if shuls are crowded, or there might be some shuls that do not act responsibly. I know that in hundreds of shuls in New York, they already forgot about COVID. There is no COVID. So I say elderly people daven at home. Shachris definitely. Even Musaf, if you can't have a responsible shul. But if you act responsibly, you wear masks. And I say this primarily in Eretz Yisrael. So there are certain places in New York in which for months there was no COVID. So maybe, I trust the local rabbanim to paskin how people need to act. I'm not the posek for every little shul in the entire world. But in those places like Eretz Yisrael, in which the disease is very active, it's rampant. We have 4,000 cases every day. We have people dying every day. So nevertheless, I think if you wear masks and you're spaced out, you could be relatively calm. So the Bekiva Eger and the Zeicha Yehosef in their day and age, they recommended leaving out piyutim. But I do think if you wear masks and you're not crowded, Chazonim in my shul, I asked them, cut out some of the singing. We won't be selling aliyas. We'll do all the selling by night. Cut short the Misha Beirachs. But I do plan to go through the entire davening. We're going to skip some of the Nigunim, but I do not plan to skip piyutim, even though the Bekiva Eger and the Zeicha Yosef in their day and age recommended skipping piyutim. As I explained before, cholera and COVID are not exactly the same, but it is noteworthy that Bekiva Eger writes, I don't want the davening to take more than 5 hours from Yigdal till the end of Musaf. And those 5 hours include a hafsok of a half hour in which everybody goes home to eat. So that's quite a short davening for Rosh Hashanah, 5 hours, including a half hour hafsok. So many shuls will be skipping, and I wrote a detailed shuva, what to skip if you need to skip. What do I mean if you need to skip? In SSO, we'll be having many outdoor minyanim. And if it's going to be hot, it's going to be very difficult. Many places in the world, I just spoke to Rabbanim in Belgium, Santiago, Chile. So in Belgium, the authorities allow 20 people in a closed room, not more than 20. So they put up tents, and they're going to have many outdoor minyanim. In many places in the world, if it's cold or hot, it's going to be very difficult. Toiv ma'at bekavona, mahar b'shaloi bekavona. Many shuls will need to do 2 minyanim, a nate's minyan and a second minyan. So if the nate's minyan davens for 6 hours, there can be no second minyan. So if you need to cut the davening short, I wrote a detailed shuva, what to skip. But if you could go through the entire davening and just skip the Misha Beirach, skip the selling the aliyas, then I don't think we should forego any part, because the davening Rosh Hashanah is so, so precious and means so much to all of us and to Klal Yisrael.
And a note here from Kalva Cholim, not to tamper with the...
I don't hear you well. I don't hear you well suddenly.
Hello?
No.
Can you hear me now?
Fine. Yes, that was fine.
Okay, so Kalva Cholim, not to tamper in any way with the misper of the tekiyos, which we only have 1 day this year, and there's some...
Right. So let me speak about the tekiyos now. I saw many Rabbanim recommending only have 60 tekiyos because that's Ikar Hadinyan, the Shloshim of Miyushav and Shloshim of Ma'umad. One of my guidelines is how much time are we saving? So Mea Koilis is only a minig. It's not a chiyuv. But it's a minig brought in Taisus, the Lamed Gimel Rosh Hashanah, the Rosh. And it's a minig which is first found in the Aruch, going all the way back to Tkufas HaGa'onim. It's a very early minig. And how much time are we saving by skipping 40 koilas? If you have a normal Baltakaya, it's not more than 10 minutes. I don't think so. So how much time are you saving? I don't think for saving 8 minutes, 10 minutes, it's kedai not to have Mea Koilas. After all, Shofar is the centerpiece of the Avodah of Rosh Hashanah. תקלפונה בשפע של העל כדי שזכור לכם אלו של יצחק בן אברהם ומעלה נהיה לכם כאילו עקדתם את עצמכם. אם לפונה זכרונס כדי שיעלה זכרונכם לפונה לטוב ובמה לשפע. I could quote so many Gemaras and Mamor Chazal. We want to get the utmost out of Shofar. So once again, if you need to make space for a second minyan. I think the Rav and the Gaboim and the Chazonim should go to the entire Seder Atfilah this week and see exactly how much time it'll take. How much time do we have? If you have the time, don't skip any tkiyas. If you don't, then you need to go into an analysis, which I did, which I wrote a tshuva, which I could make available. But once again, if you could not skip anything, I don't plan on my shul to skip. I really hope that everybody will follow the rules, and at some point we say Shoyme mitzvah lo yede davaro, Shoyme pesul Hashem, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu should look out for all of us.
Okay.
So, you know, the basic point of the question is how much time it's safe to be together. Because all the doctors would agree, and the medical experts, the more time you spend together, the bigger the chashash of contagion is, of getting infected. But we do not have any scientific data to determine 2 hours, 2.5 hours, 2 hours, 45 minutes, 3 hours, 3.5, 4. We don't have any medical data to determine how much time it is safe to be together. So if you wear masks, you distance yourself, you're doing your hishtadlus. I think all the rest could be left up to HaKadosh Baruch Hu.
There's a follow-up question here, which is not directly Negea, but I'm going to pose it sensitive. I'm going to pose it to the Rav anyway. As the Rav mentioned, here in America, since we had, Baruch Hashem, several months of relative calm, people started loosening restrictions. We have now had resurgences, relatively mild. Of course, if all of a sudden you are in the hospital, it's not mild. And a lot of this seems to be centered on chasnas. Very difficult to help people in chasnas, and I've seen some of them not to have normal chasnas, but this is what's happening here. Does the Rav want to comment on this? Because I'm sure it's again our Yisrael too.
I do want to comment, and I never shy away from saying things I believe in, even though I might make some people angry. I'm always makpid and kvoid abrius, and I never use harsh language. I know some Rabbanim said, you know, if you don't wear a mask, you're a tzayach, you're a roideif. I don't think you're a tzayach. I don't think you're a roideif. I think you're doing something terribly wrong. And I relate various shiurim, and I said this many times. A person cried to me with bitter tears because it was obvious to him he worked in a facility of the elderly in a nursing home. He was not careful. He should have been in quarantine, and he went to his job, and he was convinced that he infected many people, and one of them died. And this, he will feel this till the end of his days, the responsibility of bringing about indirectly the demise of a person. I think these mass chasanas are a central source of spreading the disease, and I think it's awful. I myself, for the past 6 months, I'm not going to any simchas. I went 2 or 3 times to Sunday course and Siddur Kedusha, and every time I went, I regretted it. Even though everybody wore masks. Because when I come, people put on their masks. And they think they're yotze with that. But I regretted every time I went to a simcha, and I stopped going to simchas. And my closest friends and even family, I don't go to simchas. For a few months, we had very small chasanas. And to the best of my knowledge, the chassan and the kala were so happy. I was moved. I was surprised. I thought chassanim and kalas would prefer putting off the chasana. No. In almost all the cases, they preferred having family-oriented simcha. So I think these mass simchas are the primary source for the spread of the disease. And in essence, all we're paying the price for these chasanas. I think it's awful. I think chasanas should be, in this period, should be very small. Siblings, maybe first cousins, very, very small and spaced out. And believe me, the chassan and the kala will be happy with each other. And that's what a chassan should be about. That's what chassan should be about. You don't need 500 people to come to a chassan and spend $500,000 and spread the disease to 10,000 people directly and indirectly. That's wrong. So that is what I have to say about these mass chasanas, and I apologize to anyone that I offended, but once again, I don't mean anyone in particular, but this is my feeling. So the government of Israel has become totally dysfunctional. For 2 months, they did nothing about simchas and chasanas and get-togethers and demonstrations, and now suddenly, Erev Rosh Hashanah, they realized that many people are going to shuls. They're not anti-Semites, b'shum oifin not. We're living in a Yiddish Medina. We all love each other, and they have good intentions. But sometimes smart people do foolish things, and people with good intentions are not always right. So I do think in shuls we need to be very, very careful. But where was the government for 2 months when we had hundreds and thousands of mass simchas and nothing was done about it?
Okay, 2 more sensitive questions. And I'll put them both on the table so the Rav can think about them, since you can do several things at once. Number 1 is, should there be any reason to be Mishana, the Minig Yisrael of Mikvah Weiss on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur? 2, touchy question. If and when a vaccine is developed, and obviously there are going to be numerous medical fakes about this, what is the chiyuv of a Torah Yid legabe vaccine? Very complicated question with numerous factual questions, but I'm just putting on a table now because I don't know when the next time we'll be able to get this kind of an answer and this kind of a tzibur.
Okay, so regarding mikvos, once again, it depends on the situation and the numbers. I don't want to be offensive. Some places in New York, the disease is almost non-existent. A mikveh means so much to all of us, primarily to Hasidim, especially at Rosh Hashanah, and more so Erev Yom Kippur. There's a minhag that women go to the mikveh Erev Yom Kippur. And it's a very early minhag, brought in many choshev sources, even in Poskim. For the past few months, I've been saying that Tishu Kabin B'Shas Chak is as good as a mikveh. So in Eretz Yisrael, definitely, when the pandemic is still at its height, even Rosh Hashanah, I say, if you could go when there are very few people in the mikveh, and in men's mikvahs, we have an automatic carousel, and you could set the computer in a way that only 7 or 8 or 9 people could be at the mikveh at the same time, and it's a relatively spacious mikveh, then you could feel relatively safe, but I still prefer Tishu Kabin. So if you stand under the shower for 5 minutes, that's Tishu Kabin. And my opinion is that a shower passes for Tishu Kabin. B'Shas Chak, it's as good as a mikveh. Would I say the same in Borough Park or Williamsburg? Maybe not. And once again, I think there are so many choshev poskim in America. I rely on them. So in those places in America in which the disease is almost non-existent, even though numbers have been slightly ticking up, I rely on the American poskim. There are so many choshev rabbanim in America, they don't need my advice. But in places like Eretz Yisrael, in which the disease is rampant, I don't want to see hundreds of people coming together in mikvahs. That, once again, is a way to spread the disease because most of the mikvahs are not ventilated. Many of them are underground. They do not have proper ventilation. And so many people will be exhaling and inhaling, especially when you're after a very hot mikvah or a hot shower. It's a source of infection. So if the disease is really, really around, I would say Tishu Kabin, Shas Chak, it's as good as a mikveh. But it depends on the circumstances. What was the other question of Shlomo? Number 2.
Vaccines.
Vaccines, yeah. This is a question which is so dependent on the medical information. So Russia is Russia. So Putin developed a vaccine and he demanded that every government official must take this vaccine. So we're going to skip the mice, we're going to skip the monkeys, we're going to skip the trial tests, we're going to skip many stages. Anybody that has a government job, take this vaccine. If not, I don't know. You might be fired, you might be shot, I don't know. Every society has its own set of rules. In Western culture, we don't usually take chances. And there are various trials before we make a vaccine available to the broad public. I think it is legitimate in a time of crisis, like in this pandemic, maybe to skip some of the stages, but we cannot encourage the broad public to take a vaccine unless we know that there's a fair chance of success and we're exposing people to a minimal risk. I wrote about this in the Minchas on Corona, which is not 100% finished yet because I was waiting for many shilas regarding Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Shlit to be addressed. I hope the Sefer in its final version will be coming out right after Yom Tov. So I did discuss the vaccine, and once again, I suggest that I could make the Sefer available. But at this stage, all I could say is, I think we need to do our best to make a vaccine available as soon as possible. But we cannot put the public at risk if it's a substantial risk, hoping to achieve a vaccine. So that is about all I can say at this stage because I don't have the numbers before me and I don't know what the pros and cons are, what are the potential risks, and what is the chance of success.
Okay.
So I think we could take one more or two more questions.
Yeah, 1 or 2 more questions. I'm looking at the clock. I know the Rav's deadline. The Rav has a deadline here because, as you mentioned earlier, there's going to be another share to the Rabbanim, I believe, in South America. A big chashuv item. So thank you for every moment of your time. A specific question, assuming someone can only go for what set of kailis, which 30, assuming somebody's coming from home and is making a shortened version because it's warranted. Which kailis?
Malchi Zechrona Shofes Chazos Ashatz. This is a major discussion which is not related to COVID. Min Chasosha Moedem Chelak Aleph, not the Sichas. The Lamdish Sefer, there's a very substantial siman dealing with the question, which are the more important kailas, Miyushav or Mu'umad? I think the more important Atki is the Mu'umad, but then you're losing the bracha. So that's another problem, because when will you say the bracha? You can't say the bracha before the Shemoneh Esrei because davening will be a hefsek. You can't say the bracha in middle of the Shemoneh Esrei because the bracha might be a hefsek. So therefore, in practicality, even though Chazos Hashatz is more important, but if one could only come to a very limited period of time, he should come to Tkiyas the Miyushav and hear the brachas and be Yotzei the Tkiyas.
Okay, last question here from a gerontologist who treats Alzheimer patients. The Rav Psukim Legabe Alzheimer's are generally well known to the medical community. Is there any shinui, since the Alzheimer patients cannot tell you often that they're suffering COVID symptoms? Is there any shinui this year when you get in light of the Mageva?
Well, I think Alzheimer's patients should be taken care of, regardless of Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur. And if they cannot express their needs, they need to be in medical supervision. We need to know what's happening with them. And I think they should be tested and taken care of, not only regarding COVID, regarding any other ailment. Because, usually one of the very early philosophers said that pain is the greatest gift that Kadosh Baruch Hu gave to people. Because pain is usually the first telltale siman that you're ill. If not for pain, people would just die of terrible illness without knowing and without treating. So in a way, pain is a gift. And it is the first way to discover or be aware that you need to be treated. But that is if people could express their pain. If you have an Alzheimer's or another demented person that is suffering from dementia and he might not have the ability to express his needs and his discomfort or his pain, then he needs to be in urgent medical supervision. So that would affect not only questions of Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, of fasting, but much more all-encompassing way how we treat people that might not have the ability to express their discomfort, their pain, or their medical needs. Of course, it would affect the question of fasting Yom Kippur as well. The most fascinating question regarding Alzheimer's, and it's not a milsa de shchicha, doesn't happen very common, but I wrote a tshuva about this, and it was just such a challenging question. So a person had Alzheimer's, but he also was desperately ill, and he needed to eat in Yom Kippur. Not related to Alzheimer's, but related to his physical condition. But there was no way to convince him that he needs to eat on Yom Kippur. In no way would he agree to eat on Yom Kippur. But most of the day, he wasn't aware of Yom Kippur. He was vaguely aware. And his son was sitting next to him. And his son knew before Yom Kippur what will happen, and he knew what to expect. And he asked me this question. I will tell my father he needs to eat. And he'll say, no, it's Yom Kippur. The only way I could convince him is by telling him, it's not Yom Kippur. Abba, it's not Yom Kippur. You're mistaking. And then he will say, if it's not Yom Kippur, I want you to eat together with me. Could I eat together with him if there's no other way to convince him to eat? Fascinating question. So I mentioned the Psak of Reb Salanter, what was the basis of telling healthy people they should eat on Yom Kippur? And one of the two interpretations I explained, bearing in mind, if the healthy won't eat, neither will the ill. So the psak was the healthy should eat because otherwise the ill might be paying with their lives. So this question, I only found one source, and that is in a kovetz. I think it's probably the first kovetz that came out. Today we have hundreds of kovetzim, halachic periodicals, monthly, weekly, yearly, biannual. 350 years ago, in Beis Medrash Eitz Chaim in Amsterdam, they printed a kovetz named Eitz Chaim. And one of the Talmidei Chachomim wrote an article. We know nothing about him. He didn't develop to be a famous gadol. But he wrote an article exactly about this question. And his conclusion is, healthy person has no heter to eat in order to cause a chodesh yesh v'sakona to eat. And I disagree. And I think if there's no other way to bring that Alzheimer's patient to eat, you need to be serious. You don't want to eat on Yom Kippur. But if you're convinced there's no other way to convince my father to eat, my psak was yes. Well, pretend.